So we might begin. I'd like to welcome everyone here to Tara Institute on this Monday. This is the first of a month of Monday nights that I'll be leading, and also there's a one-day workshop at the end, which isn't sort of necessarily connected, but it will be complementary, shall we say. So I'm going to sort of design them so that they'll weave together. But I'm also very open to the flow of what actually occurs on the Monday nights as to how the one-day workshop will be shaped. So I'm deliberately keeping the format open in a creative, responsive way so that it will be of most benefit and interest. So, as I'm sure we've all done many times, we're going to begin with a meditation. And it's a very simple technique, and it's a technique that is alarmingly simple. And I use the word alarmingly quite deliberately because it's almost unbearably simple. We'll find that in our approach to our object of meditation, which is bare awareness of the breath, that everything else will go on in our minds other than awareness of the breath. It's almost as though the very choice of the simplicity, the sheer simplicity of the topic, will throw our habitual chaotic minds into sharp and perhaps disturbing relief. So that's to be expected. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why so many beginner meditators, so to speak, give up in the very early stages of wishing to develop a meditation practice, because they take a peep in, as it were, into the space of their mind and discover chaos or impulses that are so powerful that they can't even stop reaching for the iPhone while on their meditation cushion. It's that sort of mind that's searching for experience, searching for stimulation, searching for some kind of satisfaction that is outside the framework of the meditation that will prove so incredibly distracting. So the meditation has a kind of an elective quality. We have to choose, in other words, to pick up our mind when it's wandered off our object, the sheer awareness of the breath, and replace upon the breath. And that action of replacement is in fact very profound, because through the mere act of replacement we have consolidated the flow of the meditation. We've reconfirmed what we're doing, we've re-established where we're going with this. The moment we let the second thought of a distraction arise without returning to the breath, technically speaking, we're no longer meditating. We're drifting, we're daydreaming. Now, to all extents and purposes, we are meditating because we're sitting here looking like we are. But if our mind is in no way being called back to our meditation object, then we're simply using this position, this posture, which is pretty impressive because it looks like we're really placid and serene, is in fact simply a basis for our usual mental habits and perhaps our chaotic minds. So that's not meditation. The posture itself isn't meditation. It's what we're doing with our mind. And so mindfulness, which is this essential quality that enables the continuity of our awareness of the object to continue, this essential quality has to be continually reinforced. And so the definition of mindfulness, rather surprisingly, is memory. It's a form of memory in that we have to recall what it is that we're just doing in the immediate next moment. And that's also very profound. In the very next moment, we remember to place our mind on the breath that we're doing in the exact previous moment without any space. The moment we forget to remember to do that is when a distraction occurs. It's almost like a hand reaching in to the body of our meditation and pulling us away from our object, because we're distracted. We're not noticing that we've forgotten, literally forgotten our object. And so the idea is to have mindfulness continuously. This awareness of the awareness of remembering is continually being revived, vitalised. We don't let it become slack or lazy. The other essential ingredient in this particular meditation is referred to as discriminating alertness. And in some of the texts it will refer to vigilance. And the analogy of someone peeping into a room as a spy to see what's going on without themselves being detected is a very appropriate one, because this aspect of discriminating alertness has a different function from mindfulness. It's not remembering the object, because that's mindfulness's job. It's peeping in on the scene of mindfulness on the object and just seeing if it's in fact in place as it's meant to be. And more often than not, it's possible that we've forgotten to be mindful. And so it's discriminating alertness that picks that situation up, identifies it, stimulates mindfulness to reassert itself and replace the awareness on the breath. If we attempt to have discriminating alertness happening all the time, like we'll be overly anxiously checking, we'll become agitated and nervous. It'll become a form of stress. If we try to meditate too hard, we actually can stress ourselves. So discriminating alertness is incredibly subtle, incredibly light-footed, incredibly discreet. It's got slippers on. No one hears it. It can't even hear itself, it's so subtle. It's very sharp, very clear, very precise, and very swift. If it peeps in, and there's nothing wrong in the scene of the meditation, so to speak, wrong, there's nothing out of place, it quietly closes that door and no one even notices it was opened. So it never makes a show of itself. It never blusters around, making waves. So there's a balance between these two aspects, and we learn to regulate or orchestrate that balance in the same way that we would if we were playing two hands on the piano. They speak to each other to create the overall quality of the meditation, but they do that in a very, very intuitive and gentle manner. So why are we doing the meditation? It's good to ask these questions all the time. It's in order to bring an initial sense of poise and stability to our chaotic minds so that we can attain a point of awareness which is restful, alert, and relaxed. This is a very, very special state of mind. Who's had it today? Alert, stable, relaxed state of awareness. We normally find the moment we wake up that we're tumbling over ourselves with all the things we're going to be doing before we've even put our foot on the floor, out of our bed. So this meditation interrupts that process. It provides us with another kind of place or space to dwell for a period of time. And in that space, we have the opportunity of coming to see what's happening in a way that isn't otherwise available. The only other time we have this sometimes is on holidays. And any of you had trouble on holidays? We've suddenly been confronted by yourself, sitting there on your deck chair next to a swimming pool in Bali with a martini, thinking this is bliss, And then suddenly all these preoccupations, these obsessions, all these doubts about the way your life's going, what the relationships you're in mean, etc., coming to haunt you in a very, very powerful and disturbing manner. So this kind of space, if you like, this sudden cessation of the usual habitual mechanics of our daily life, say in the city, our working life, our family life and so forth, that we've interrupted to go on holidays, is in some important and problematic ways kept our realisation of what's occurring in maybe deeper ways in ourselves at bay. We've been skating with a kind of desperate dexterity on the surface of our own anxieties, attempting not to fall over by being speedy and brilliant in our footwork. We keep going until we fall over exhausted, if not before. So there's a kind of mechanics there which is really hard to break without anxiety or panic coming in. So meditation is a completely different way of approaching this kind of habitual, compulsive urgency to somehow be doing life in the right way that's going to work for me and those people around me. This kind of ambition to be happy, which of course is so essential to us. We're not saying that's not a good thing. That's the bedrock of what we're seeking. All of us are seeking. But the manner in which we approach obtaining that object is the issue here. And so just learning to sit gently and quietly with ourselves in a state of alert peacefulness is in fact a very, very precious thing, because we can call upon that in the course of our everyday life. It's as though the threshold of our habitual anxiety shifts because we've attained that soft space in meditation. We suddenly have a reference point to a quieter mind, a softer mind, a more open, creative mind than is otherwise available to us. And that gives us a glimpse into the sphere of our compulsive operations that otherwise are not visible because we're so deeply immersed. And this will happen intuitively. I'm not asking us to do any great hard work here psychologically. It's the benefits of these meditations arise out of the value of the techniques themselves. So that's why I said this one is profoundly simple. The breath is chosen for a very particular reason, because it's closely connected to our physical metabolism and even our emotional metabolism. And it's also freely available, and it's non-conceptual in the sense that we don't have to think. We simply allow the breath to flow. So there are many breathing meditations and there are many breathing yogic techniques. So I'm asking you to put aside all the other ones you know, at least for the time of this meditation, not because they're not valuable or important to you, but that in this particular technique we're simply allowing the mind to ride upon the breath, as might a leaf on the wind. So wherever the wind blows, the leaf goes. Wherever the breath goes, the mind flows. We keep those two in contact continuously. Awareness of the breath together. Discriminating alertness comes in. Is it in fact on the breath? If not, we correct it. Mindfulness has the aspect of having to remember that we're meditating on the breath, and so it's obviously also returning to the breath, but it sometimes doesn't remember to do that. So that's where discriminating alertness has to correct the mindfulness if it's kind of deteriorated. Now, the other thing to bear in mind in a meditation as simple as this is that there is a certain set of implicit problems that can arise. And they're very, when I say problems, I'm not using that word in a hard way or a judgmental way. There's some factors here which can prove very, very tricky. And probably the most common, which you'll maybe recognise, is that of sluggish inertia. We sink into a kind of torpor, a dull, vague, heavy, pre-slumber state of semi-consciousness which slowly tips into sleep. And it's not unusual when we do this meditation to have someone start snoring in the gompa because they have actually gone to sleep. So when this sort of sluggishness occurs, it's a sign in an interesting way that we don't know how to cope without getting our stimulation fixes all the time through our senses. Normally when we're getting a little bit bored, we go, what can I grab that's going to stimulate me? It might be something out of the fridge, it might be grabbing our iPad, ringing someone up, looking out the window, whatever it is. We're constantly doing this process of stimulation. Because we've cut off that pattern, it's almost as though the mind doesn't know what to do with itself, and so it sort of falls back and just becomes very, very sluggish. So one of the roles of discriminating alertness is to also check up on the tone of the mind. And another word for tone is the tension of the mind. I'm using the word tension here in the way that we talk of the string of a lute. If the awareness of the breath is too slack, it's like having a string on our lute that hasn't been sufficiently tightened, and we can't even get a dull note. Nothing will ring out. It's not going to work. And if we over-tighten it, which is equivalent to trying too hard to meditate with awareness, we're stressing, we're straining, it's like over-tightening our awareness, and it becomes brittle, fragile, and fraught. It's not going to be able to be extended for any period of time. It's too overwrought. And so that's called excitement. And so there's a kind of oscillation for most of us in our even in one session, even in 1 minute of a meditation, between being too slack, not trying hard enough, and being overly keen. So there's a sort of gentle, intermediate way of proceeding. So that's the basic framework for the meditation we're going to be doing. It's the Mia breath. For some people, they might, for some reason of nasal congestion, not be able to breathe through the nose, then simply be aware of the breath through the mouth. And if you like, you can follow the breath in a little bit and out a little bit. It's really up to you. It's just to let the mind very gently rest upon it. And before we actually begin that main body of the meditation, we're going to be doing a shorter meditation, which is referred to as the 4 immeasurable thoughts. And this is a way of shaping our attitude, if you like, or our approach to the purpose of meditating. And this is always an essential ingredient, because if we try to cut straight into a meditation without any mental preparation, it's too abrupt, and it's likely that it won't work particularly well. So in this initial phase of the meditation, we're shaping our mind around the overall purpose of meditating, which will go way beyond the framework of the actual meditation that we're doing. And another way of talking about this is that we're making an aspiration. We're aspiring to a goal. And we're saying to ourselves that through this vast aspiration, this vast ambition. I'm going to be meditating now for short duration as a stepping stone, if you like, or an ingredient to slowly make progress towards this vaster outcome. So, let's adopt our meditation postures. We'll all be in different positions depending on our comfort zones and also our experience. But one of the most important factors of a meditation posture is our back. Sometimes people, for whatever health reasons, can't sit. So it is possible to meditate lying down, but we have to be particularly aware that it's much more easy to go to sleep in that posture. So draw our mind inwards, just as we might a kite by winding back the string. So all of the distractions, all of the engagements that have preoccupied us throughout the day, even those that have preoccupied us as we've walked through the door of this meditation room. Feel that we're reclaiming all of these distractions, all of these involvements, all of these engagements, just bringing them in, just letting them rest where we are, on our cushion, with us now, right here. Just for a few cycles of in and out breath, feel that any anxieties or problems that we have leave with the out breath in the form of smoke, which dissolves, and then with the in-breath, radiant light pours into our body and our mind, relaxing, bringing clarity. Now we shape our motivation, which is a form of aspiration. Thinking how wonderful it would be if all beings without exception had happiness and its causes. May they have happiness and its causes. May I, the meditator, be able to bring this about. And here, if we're doing it from a Buddhist perspective, we can think, please, precious Buddha, inspire me thus. And this seals this wish, but we can substitute the Buddha with any other object of faith or devotion that we have. Or even just thinking that it's our own best potential that's conferring this. And the second immeasurable, may all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they be free of suffering and its causes. May I, the meditator, be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddha, inspire me thus. May all sentient beings achieve only higher rebirths and the supreme bliss of liberation. And here, if we're doing this from a non-Buddhist perspective, we can think how wonderful it would be if all sentient beings achieved all short-term and long-term goals, the most extensive ones. How wonderful this would be. May I, the meditator, be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddha, inspire me thus. May all sentient beings without exception abide in equanimity, free from attachment and hatred, free from holding some close and others distant. How wonderful this would be. May I, the meditator, be able to bring this about. Please, precious Buddha, inspire me thus. Just now, very quietly and gently, become aware of the breath. Just allowing the breath to flow in a natural rhythm. Being aware of the breath coming in and the breath going out. Even the space between an in and an out breath is the focus of our awareness. Not one portion of the breath escapes our awareness. So just like that leaf on the wind that I mentioned, on the breeze, just allow our mindfulness to alight upon the object, the breath, and remain in contact through remembering to be in contact from moment to moment in a gentle but firm yet relaxed manner. If the mind is chattering or wandering with discriminating alertness, we notice that fact and simply return our awareness to the breath, just as we might return a child who has wandered from the footpath onto the road, back to the footpath. This way we stay on the breath. It's just checking. If we're having a dialogue with our body, this is a distraction. Return to the breath. If our awareness has become too loose, slightly tighten. Or if it's too tense, just relax. Gently rest upon the breath. For the last portion of the meditation, see if we can enhance the clarity of our awareness, just seeing the breath more precisely, more vividly. Now we can let go of the breath as our main object, but before coming back to the room, just become aware of the body. Now we can very quietly open our eyes if they've been shut. We can relax our meditation postures, stretch or wriggle or whatever. So are there any questions or thoughts that came to mind while we were doing the meditation? Yeah, there's a question about the order of or the sequence, if you like, of the four immeasurables. In Lama Tsongkhapa's tradition, equanimity is first. So it depends where your looking? It's a very good question, because in general it's a very good question, because that's kind of meditation is really a means of exploring our attitudinal relation to reality, the world around us. And in order to do that, we need to kind of play with our habitual way of engaging in people, our views of people. And so I think Ingrid's point here is that we can't really wish that everyone has happiness if we only care about two people, myself and my partner. It doesn't matter what is happening to anyone else, as long as we're happy. So equanimity in the fourth immeasurable, in the way that I presented it, has a very particular aspect of not holding one person's happiness to be more or less important than another's. At least they're equal. That's an incredibly powerful thought. Just imagine for a moment that if we applied that to global politics, I won't mention American politics or Australian politics because they're harmonious, beautiful, sympathetic places of harmony and singular purposes for the good of all beings, as we know. So this mind of equanimity is actually a very, very profound mind, because it's said to be the basis upon which to build all of the virtues in relation to caring for ourselves and others. Because it also means, even with a little thought, we'll understand that it means we're equal to everyone else. And so there's a sense for many of us that we put ourselves down, we denigrate ourselves, we kind of suppress our own needs, perhaps even as a carer for someone else. I'm not saying we shouldn't care for someone else, but that if we construe that relationship in a particular way that somehow involves us suppressing our scope in order to better look after the other person, something is going to snap and go astray. So equanimity is incredibly open, because it's not protective of some brittle, narrow sense of self-importance over others, but nor is it investing a huge amount of dark, thunderous energy, if you like, into forcing myself not to have access to the world around me for whatever twisted, obscure psychological reason I've managed to conjure. And our rooms of therapy throughout our world are full of people talking about how they can't achieve their goals because of what happened to them in childhood, or this divorce was particularly nasty and I'm still getting over it 8 years later, etc. I'm not saying these aren't traumatic events, but if we try to solidify those sorts of experiences and build them into a kind of set architecture or view of who and what we really are and who and what you really are, and hold on to it with a vengeance, then something is going to snap or shatter. If not that, we won't even be able to see what's going on around us. We'll be so preoccupied by our own misery. So these are very real and very important things. So equanimity, in terms of the four immeasurables in general, is the wish that all beings have equanimity, all others have equanimity. But if we really look into that more deeply, we're also wishing that we see others equally. So there's a personal psychology at stake here. And so the question is, do we? Can we? And what will happen if we do? Won't the world as we know it fall apart? If I love my family more than anyone else, and then I suddenly decide that I love everyone equally, won't my family fall apart? Won't it get absorbed or lost in this kind of giant soup of bland equanimity where there's only equality occurring? These are the sorts of panicked responses we have to the very idea of equanimity. It's incredibly challenging, even threatening, to think of equanimity. You know, if you confront a homeless person outside Coles Safeway in Glenferrie Road, Armidale, where I live, one thinks, how much money do I have in my wallet? How much money does that person have? And then I make a calculation in that instant based on what I feel my attitude towards that person's need is. I'm simply describing the reality of it here. Now, if I have great compassion towards that person, or if I see them more equal to me, I will be able to judge that in a more generous and free manner. It's quite straightforward, isn't it? I can actually objectively and sympathetically appraise the situation without overloading it with prejudice. But if I automatically see someone who's homeless as a failure, they're probably a druggie or a violent home wrecker who's been cast out onto the streets because no one will live with them, or whatever it is, or they're the wrong race, the wrong class, wearing the wrong hair, they've got dreadlocks, who knows what it is, tattoos it used to be. It can just be the minus little sort of sign of difference that will serve to carve and push that person into another sort of detached space. And so this mind of equanimity is an incredibly important one. And so we can explore that next week because it's actually a very important technique. It's one that I was going to look at next week. But it's an interesting question about when it occurs. So the idea is to be playful because it's what is working at that moment that's really important for you in the meditation. So if you've been feeling really mean and angry today, and you're doing the meditation now feeling mean and angry, but you're trying to relax because you don't want to be mean and angry, then the idea, may others have happiness, is incredibly potent at that moment. Because the last thing you've been thinking about is their happiness. You basically want them to go away, and you're going to push them away if they dare come close, because you are in a bad mood, and they're going to pay if they venture too near. So the warning signs are there, the danger signals are flaring and flashing in every direction simultaneously when we're very, very angry in that manner. And so just to meditate on may all sentient beings have happiness at that moment is an incredibly powerful meditational technique to apply. So we don't have to feel obligated to chunk or to our way through the four immeasurables in some sort of compulsive fashion. We can simply learn the framework of the meditation and then adapt it to our actual situation. So we might meditate on the first immeasurable for weeks or months or years until some experience comes, and then move to the other three immeasurables. You could argue that that's a very, very fantastic thing to do. So from a Buddhist meditation perspective, we try to learn the frameworks of the techniques, why we're doing them, how they work, and what they consist of, and then we are free to begin to work with them in a creative way. No one is looking over our shoulder. It's up to us and our innate wisdom, our discrimination, our ability to plot a way through complexity that is to be respected and cultivated here. So are there any other questions, or how do people's... Yeah, all right. Again, it's a really, really vital and powerful question. And so I'll just sort of repeat it in my own words, because maybe not everyone heard it. If we're sort of dealing with a powerful trauma in our past, and it's had the impact of somehow solidifying and blocking us, I'm sort of elaborating a little bit here, becoming a kind of huge barrier to our sense of progress or growth, are we to consider that that embedded trauma is permanent and fixed, intrinsic, inherent to our nature, or not? This is an absolutely critical question. Buddhism, rather delightfully, is going to say that there is no problem whatsoever that is intrinsically embedded on our mind. A problem will appear for as long as the conditions for its sort of maintenance, if you like, are in place. But when those conditions have exhausted, that complex of energy that we're talking about here, this sort of blockage, will spontaneously disperse. So it might help to use an analogy here. When we're a child, can anyone remember being a child? It's kind of an interesting question, isn't it? Because we were a child and we had a school tantrum. Does anyone remember a school tantrum? And we were so tantrumed that we were just unbearable, screaming, stomping, rolling on the floor, hysterical, completely unworkable. It was the worst thing that had ever happened to anyone, that had just happened to us. Overwhelming pain and mental anguish, unbearable suffering. 10 minutes later, that child is outside laughing and giggling and running around. The conditions for that trauma, we're talking about a little tiny trauma here, which seems so huge, have no longer been maintained, and that child is free. And so Buddhism says that problems have the ability to imprint themselves on the mind. And this word imprint's a very interesting one, and it's one I can't really develop very much now, but it's worth mentioning. And it can be carried on the mind, but that given the right conditions, it can be dissolved and will no longer be present.
And that applies to the most awful trauma. The Jews in Auschwitz have that imprinted on their mind.
Mm-hmm.
And Buddhism says that there are the right conditions where that can be dispelled.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that happen?
Well, it's a very powerful, huge question again. And there are a number of techniques that are required to be used, and we have to employ all of them, really. And one of the techniques is insight, developing an awareness of the reality of the situation itself in a very, very deep and realistic manner. What does it mean? That the I that we have, that we're preserving with such force, is in fact an overestimation of what's here. What does that mean? We cling with a tenacity to a kind of concrete sense of self, which limits us to the possibility of growing and transforming. And so in order to begin to work with that, we need to look into the nature of the way in which we're appearing and the way in which other people are appearing. I'm thinking here of Emanuel Levinas. Do you know of Levinas's work at all? He was a Jewish religious theorist who was incarcerated in the concentration camps. And he developed a theory out of his experience while in the concentration camp, which has come to be known as radical alterity. And alterity means other in philosophical terms, and radical means really other. Levinas, in his bid to understand the cruelty and the pain and the devastation that was being wrought in that absolutely horrific concentration camp environment in a way that would enable him, not just him, but people to survive the suffering and also not to lose entirely their moral compass, not to be so embittered and broken that their sense of their worth being alive or human would somehow be destroyed. And he came to this conclusion that the mere fact that the other person looks at me face to face is the ground, the fundamental basis of a human ethics. Just as I don't want that person to harm me, I don't want to harm that person. He came down to that thought. And it's a very, very extraordinary thought. In order to value the other and the other's right to be happy, we don't have to know who they are or what they're doing. We're not saying that Levinas endorsed the horrific, I would have to say criminal, abysmal criminal acts that occurred in the Holocaust. It's not about that. But that the perpetrators, under somewhere buried there in those perpetrators of violence, were people who had become deformed and lost. One would have to say through ideological possession. They were possessed by perverse ideologies that were causing them to be incredibly cruel. And so Buddhism says that that's happening on a kind of a societal level in the case of Nazism. But we can also have and I'm going to use this word very carefully here, advisedly, because it's such a delicate issue. We are capable of our own little acts of hostility in our own daily lives through misguided, harmful ideologies and anger and hatred also. And so the great Saint Shanti Davis said that we should blame the afflicted mind that's causing the grief and not the person. So we have to qualify this again, because the example of the Holocaust is a very, very real one. We're not saying that we shouldn't hold that Holocaust perpetrators to reckoning, that we shouldn't in fact apply justice. That should be done, but that should be done in an open and even-handed manner, without this sort of impulse to have to wipe out and destroy the enemy, our enemy, because that's simply reflecting back the kind of problematic dynamic that was there in the first place. So Buddhism says that nothing is gained by revenge. Nothing is gained by anger. Nothing is gained by hatred. And so we have to replace all of these kinds of minds with their opposites, which are love, compassion, equanimity, and so forth. And so that brings us back to here, to this one sitting here. How do we respond as a moral agent in our world today? And this is a really, really important question for all of us, of course. I think, just looking at my own life in Australia, that, you know, we think we're a liberal democracy, but I'm getting political. Terrible sufferings going on in our refugee camps, and particularly in relation to children who have done nothing other than be the children of people who have ended up in resettlement camps, and they're completely stripped of human rights. We're allowing that in a very complex way, aren't we? And so where do we draw the line? Where do we draw the boundaries? These are constantly important questions. And so we're only ever as good as the way we relate to the very next person we encounter. And we work out from there. So these are really powerful questions. I was lecturing in art before my illness. I had bone marrow cancer. I'll just mention it because I had a break from doing Monday nights because of that. And one of the artists I used to talk about did a series of very famous photographs. He reprinted photographs of Holocaust situations, but particularly the weddings of the German officers of the concentration camps. And they partied. They had weddings. Their 3-year-old daughters had birthday cakes. How come that daughter had a birthday cake and that daughter was on a conveyor belt to a gas chamber, and that person was parting with their loved ones in an intimate setting that was being commemorated with photographs? And so this particular artist put those photographs up alongside people who hadn't been connected to concentration camps in the gallery, and people walked in, and the interesting thing is they couldn't tell by looking at those photos who was a Nazi perpetrator and who was just a German citizen having a birthday party. Very, very extraordinary thing to do as an artist, isn't it? Where is the difference Buddhism is going to say the difference is in the mind itself. And so that gets back to this question about the inherent existence of a trauma in a really interesting way, doesn't it? We have to produce the force that becomes traumatic through our own actions, if someone else is traumatised by our actions. So we have to begin to become aware of these things. So it's quite a serious topic to get onto, but oddly enough, I was when I was about to have my stem cell transplant in the bone marrow transplant isolation unit at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, I picked a book on the Holocaust for my light reading. And you might think, why? And because it was the most real literature that I could think of reading at that particular time. And so is anyone here who's read Inga Clendenden's book called Reading the Holocaust? She died a few years ago. She was a Melbourne historian, but a very, very eloquent writer. And she wrote a book about the possibility of writing about trauma. And she concluded that one can't actually write trauma. It's unwritable. It's unrepresentable. It's incapable of being symbolised. And so, how do we then preserve the memory of the trauma? This is something that the Jewish Museum in Melbourne is constantly working with. You know, how do we actually transmit the knowledge of what people are capable of doing from one generation to the next? So this is what parents are doing right this very minute, what we're doing with our loved ones and our families, trying to impart values that are going to be nourishing. So Buddhism talks about virtue, not from a moral perspective that's externally applied, which is the way that we tend to think of it from a theological perspective, where we've got some powerful divine agency saying this is right and this is wrong, and if you have to do this and not that, and if you do this, that will happen, if you do that, that will happen. Buddhism is saying that our morality must spontaneously arise from the quality and the nature of our actions, of body, speech and mind. So if my physical action is a fist that is being thrown out with vehemence by an angry mind to wound and hurt someone, then that is a negative action. It's the opposite of a virtuous action, and it will leave an imprint on my mind. And that imprint is a form of latency, a kind of instinctive habituation that will make it easier in the future for me to punch someone. This is a really, really interesting thing to think about. When they train soldiers, this is happening with our own Australian air soldiers, and they're teaching target practice. I don't know how many of people know about this stuff. They start with blobs in front of them. And then as they become more accurate with their shooting, they begin to personify the blobs by putting on faces. And then they put on actual caricatures of people. And then if they're fighting in another country where there's a racial dimension, they'll actually racialise the portrait on the dummy that is shot. And this is to train the soldier into being able to wound that object impulsively without thought through the force of prior habituation. This is an extraordinary idea, isn't it? And so His Holiness the Dalai Lama proposes that this is one of the reasons why people who have fought in wars come back kind of damaged. He's talking about the damage being very real. It's not saying it's permanent, but there is real damage there. And he calls it coarseness. Those people have been made coarse because everyone who appears to them if you like, I mean, I'm sort of exaggerating a little bit, but to make a point, is just another one of those dummies, facialised dummies. They're not looking at the person, they're looking at an object. They're killing an object, not a person. The reason soldiers are traumatised is that they recognise that there's a person that they've just shot, face to face, as Levinas was saying. They go up to a house, someone appears in the doorway, looks them in the face, and they shoot them. That trauma is so intense because it's real. And so Buddhism says swing that right around 360 degrees. Every time you see someone, your first thought is love and protection. How can I benefit this person? Spontaneously arising, just as it does with my cherished partner or my cherished child or my cherished parents, my cherished mother, my cherished neighbour. And then we try to extrapolate and spread it outwards. So it's been quite a interesting series of questions, hasn't it? So let's just, we'll have to look at the time. So I'll just invite us now to just sit quietly for a few moments. And it's very beneficial at the end of a meditation to give away any benefits of that meditation towards the aspirations that were set in the beginning. And so the traditional Buddhist dedication is, may the awakening mind that has arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen never decline, but grow forevermore. So next week we're going to do some meditations. We're going to do two different sorts of meditation. They're going to be the main body of the session. One of them is going to be looking at this mind of love that I've been talking about. And we meditate on love not as an object, but as a subject. We try to unify our mind with love. Our mind becomes loving in meditation. We develop the ability to love in meditation. This is an incredible, wonderful thing to begin to do. And the second meditation is what we call an objective object of a meditation. We're going to be looking at the nature of impermanence and really going to that with some detail, because this is also an incredibly powerful way of meditating. And so we're going to be exploring different ways of meditating to achieve different outcomes, different results, different experiences. So it's going to be quite a playful and open process. We can adjust it as we go along as well. So thank you very much for your time tonight, and there's tea and coffee in the hall